What's going on, everybody, and welcome to an unknown episode of the Book Binge. You see it in the title and the description what episode it actually is, depending on when it releases. That is all I need to say about that. This week we're talking about a book I discussed in mid October, yeah, basically mid to late October of 2023, titled "At Night All Blood Is Black" by David Diop. That video that I did before on it was a spoiler talk reading diary type of video. The reason I did that was because this book is much different than many of the other books I've read in that it basically forces you to analyze it, to be able to get anything out of it. The last few chapters are quite crazy in that sense. So I have already done a spoiler talk where I went through and talked about some of the spoilers of what happens, or what we know what happened, and then sort of the theories or some of the ideas that I have for the thematic aspects of that, and then my understanding of what happened. So it's not the best video in the entire world, and it would have been a better analysis if it was fully scripted, but that was just not going to be the case for that one. Either way, I did do that. So if you've read the book and you want to know more about the ending, you're not going to find that here. You can find that in the other video. I'm sure I'll have it linked in the description below because I'm going to mention it multiple times. Today's video is a spoiler-free review, just like I do for basically all the other books that I read. So this one's going to be, a little bit different. Let's talk about what I thought of Annabib without the spoilers. And yes, I did just call it Annabib because At Night All Blood Is Black is just too cumbersome to say multiple times. So let's start with the good. Just as always, I think this review is going to be quite short because I did that 30-minute discussion on all the spoilers of it. So I'm going to feel like I have less to say here. I do think that the primary good of this book is a fantastic focus on the literary elements of it. The themes, the subtext, the inner mind of the narrator. These ideas are, I think, primarily what Diop, the author, was going for. A lot of this kind of really just goes with the idea that, like, literary fiction is not something that really exists today, especially not to the same degree that it did once upon a time. And granted, a lot of books that were written, 50, 60, 70, 100, 200 years ago were not written all in the same genre. What we consider to be classics is not a genre. But many classics tend to be just literary fiction. They're not genre fiction. They're not meant to be sci-fi. They're not meant to be fantasy. They're not meant to be horror specifically. A lot of classics tend to just be kind of doing their own thing, and a lot of that is with literary purpose. You don't see that a lot today because most readers are reading genre fiction. That is what people are doing. So to find a book like this that feels to me very much like literary fiction and doesn't really fit within any genre fiction, standings, is kind of an interesting release. It's really an interesting book to have been released within the last 5 years because of that, especially with the English translation is only a few years old at this point. The original French version was in 2018, I think, so it's really not that old. Some of the other things that I do think are really good about Annabib come primarily with the great descriptions and depictions of war, if not a great picture painted of the war front. So it's because it's more literary, a lot of the aspects to war are related to the themes and the subtext and the inner mind of the narrator. So that's where most of that comes in very good, even if the war front itself maybe isn't the best depicted, but it's also a really short book, so it wasn't meant to be a super descriptive analysis or a super descriptive depiction of the battlefield or anything like that. Similarly, like I've just mentioned a couple times, it's a very great way to show the inside of a mind, the inside of the narrator's mind, especially a mind that has been fractured. More on that idea in that spoilery video. I'm not going to go more into that here. There are insane amounts of subtext and metaphor here as well that I have mentioned multiple times up to this point already, requiring analysis to interpret it. And directly so, the last few chapters of the book basically force you to think about what you just read to have an idea of what went on. I would say for the most part, the first 20 chapters or so, at least in the version that I read, it's 25 chapters, just straight up. The first 20 chapters are straightforward enough. There's a lot to dig into and a lot to analyze within that material, but it's straightforward enough that you kind of get the picture of what's going on. And then the last 5 chapters completely change that. So as such, this isn't the easiest book to read, let alone understand, but I do think the focuses that the author is putting on the writing of this book work quite well. As for the bad, I think most of this comes with the writing. If you're not connected to the style of the writing or the prose in it, it might not work the best for you. In fact, I didn't necessarily love it. I do think it was effective for the narration because of the first person narration, but it may not be your favorite. It wasn't my favorite. I would completely understand if someone didn't like it for that reason. Furthermore, within the actual writing itself, the book does get a bit repetitive with certain terms and phrases, certain things like God's truth, using God's truth as in like honestly, or I swear, or anything like that, or I swear to God as an example. My more than brother, when the narrator talks about another character. There are certain phrases that are just used a ton, and it does get a little bit wearisome after a while, especially if you're trying to read this all in like one day. I read it in 2 days, and there were points where it's like, okay, can we stop using this phrase? It's important, or it's not necessarily important to the story that those phrases are used, but I do think the language of the book actually would be a little bit more effective in the original version of it, the French version, rather than the translation. I can't speak to that because I don't speak French or read it, and I haven't tried reading the French version, obviously, but I do think that some of that would come in a little bit more strongly in the original version versus the English version. But since the English version is what I read, that's what I can comment on. Kind of as that suggests, the language of the book is kind of purposely crafted in the way that it is. You can tell it's intentional. It isn't simply bad prose, but it could still be a little bit annoying. In terms of the ugly, however, there is some material here that might not suit some people. There is a scene in the very end. This is, I guess it's spoilery, but there is a scene at the end where a character forces themselves on another character. As deep as I'll go. There is certain thematic and subtextual relations to this, so it's not like a just completely pointless scene. I understand why the scene exists. There's thematic relevance to it, but there does exist the scene, and some people aren't going to love that. And generally speaking, the themes and the subtext, some of it is quite suggestive. A trigger warning could be applied because of what I just mentioned. For more on most of this material, if you've read the book already, you can check out the diary to get my interpretation of what happened in the book. But it is a decently dark book. It isn't butterflies and rainbows, that is for sure. As for the recommendation, it's hard to recommend. Doesn't necessarily mean don't read it, but it's hard to say go read this the way that I do with many of the books that I read. I ultimately gave it 4 stars, and for the majority of the book, I was thinking it would be a 4-star read. The last 5 chapters had me debating if it would be a 3-star read, until I thought about it a little bit more because it forced me to think about the book. And when I did, I kind of saw what the purpose of the end was, even though it was really weird and confusing. And then I was like, okay, yeah, this is probably 4 stars. Plus, I just respect the fact that the author went for that. Not very many people are going to write a book and then have, the last few pages of it do something that forces your readers to be like, excuse me, what? And then think about what they just read. So, if nothing else, then that, I enjoyed it quite a bit, and amongst my friends, basically everybody has also rated it 4 stars, and I think 4 stars can generally be seen as, yeah, I recommend this book, but I don't know, this book is really hard to purposely, recommend. Like I said, there's some disturbing and dark content, though most of it is implied, for generally speaking. There is some of it that is quite graphically described, but there are points of it where it's not. There is that one particular scene, like I said, if you're sensitive to that, maybe don't read it. But on the topic of the literary fiction side of things, I think that Annabib is a book that could be considered a modern classic, and if nothing else, I think it would be considered a classic further into the future. Not just because it is one of the rare literary fiction books published in these days, but also because of that forcing you to analyze it perspective. That's not something that books tend to do. I think this is one that many people could read if you're interested in a little bit of a brain buster, not because it's impossible to read or impossible to interpret, but if you want something that'll make you think and that forces you to think a little bit, even within such a very small cover. It's not like Gravity's Rainbow where it's 800 pages of what in the world are these words being put together, right? But this book is one that I could see a lot of people reading solely for the purpose of being able to analyze it. And this might be a trend that we see over the years as we go into the future, as it becomes referred to more as a classic or a modern classic. So that is my thoughts on the book. I enjoyed it much more than the book I replaced it with on my TBR, if that says anything. And although it's hard to decide whether to widely recommend it, I do think it will be a classic in its time. And for that reason, I suppose I recommend it, but understand what you're getting into if you were to start it. And if you do decide to read it, or if you have already read it, just as I said, I have a reading diary video. I have a spoiler talk on the book that goes into more or less my interpretation. So if you want to read the book and then watch that and get my idea of what happened, and maybe shoot your own ideas in the comments of that video, what you think it was about, you can absolutely do that. Thank you for watching this somewhat short video. I appreciate it. I'll see you guys in the next one, whatever it is, because I frankly have no idea.